Okay, well, thank you everybody for joining us. Again, my name's Scott Pritchard. I work with the CSE out of Montreal. I'm a senior advisor there. And I'm here with Maruf Raza from MNP. He's a partner and head of the director of public companies is his title. So really appreciate you taking the time, Maruf, to talk to us. As you know, this is our CSE Cannabis Week, week 2 now, I think, and been very successful. We've had a lot of the top CEOs on and a great audience to follow us. So just before we get there, though, Maruf, I'd like the audience to know a little bit more about you. Just a bit of your background, if you don't mind. I think you come from an accounting family, if I can say that from my memory. And tell us how you got there into MNP, if you don't mind.
Yeah, for sure. I guess the first question I'll start off with is I'm sure everybody's asking, you guys had a lot of good cannabis CEOs. What the heck is an accountant doing here talking in the middle of Cannabis Week? And so part of that is, yeah, as you said, I come from a litany of accountants. I had no interest in being an accountant. And then you know what? When I came to Canada many years ago, I kind of stumbled into it, and here I am. And so the connection to cannabis is, I think MNP, we're a mid-market firm. We do about 500 public companies, many of them on the CSE. And circa the time when CSE was making its decision, when medical cannabis was coming out in its original format, 2014-ish. We had a similar discussion like the CSE, and there was a discussion on whether we should be part of this emerging sector, and there was a lot of natural humming and hawing, discussions about oh, it's cannabis, it's drugs, and what I think we sat back and we said, what, it's a legal enterprise, federally legal. We are a very entrepreneurial minded firm. And in fact, many of the people we supported on other deals were coming into the cannabis sector. So it said it made sense for us. We had a lot of checks and balances back in those days, but we got in. We were probably the first firm that
Right.
got in, and so we did a number of those original cannabis deals that went public on the CSE. We came on as the accountants or auditors. And fast forward to today, we represent probably 50% of the Canadian LPs in some fashion. We work globally, so any company globally that's cannabis related has looked at Canada and the CSE, from a market perspective, and in many cases we act so for those companies. And so roundabout way, answering your question, which is, who am I? I would say I'm the accountant to a bunch of the cannabis guys. And I think that, I think you've spoken to a lot of the CEOs, and I think when we thought we could come in, because we see sort of the more macro level perspective, because we're working on so many of these companies. So to perhaps provide an objective view of what we see in the sector from our perspective.
Right, exactly. So I think your company and our company have both really profited from the cannabis legalization here in Canada. We've grown incredibly. Why don't you just give a few minutes on MNP and where you're located and how much have you grown in the last few years?
For sure. So from an overall firm perspective, we are the 5th largest firm in Canada. We have over 70 offices. We're definitely in some ways a traditional accounting firm. The one thing that differentiates us and really that brought us into the cannabis sector is we are passionately mid-market, right? So what that means is our clients are from startup to, we have clients obviously in the cannabis sector that are billions in market cap, but we work with entrepreneurs. And so that is really what separates us as a firm and really what brought us, as I said, into the cannabis sector. And here we are.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, our growth has been tremendous. It's,
Right.
We're very conscious of how much of, the cannabis market we have had. And hopefully we've provided some value back to that sector. But it has been an incredibly fast-growing part of our overall firm.
So let's dive in a bit in the cannabis sector on a high-level basis. What do you see? Maybe we have to separate Canada and the U.S., or maybe not, but I would imagine there's going to be a lot of restructuring possibly going on, some M&A. You know the numbers better or quicker than we do, and just as a general trend, how do you see the marketplace evolving 2020 plus?
Yeah, so I think that there's two elements. So I think there's obviously the market perspective, and then there's the operational perspective. And so I think anybody who's been reading the media and the news, there's been a lot of criticisms leveled at the cannabis sector, because we had a tremendous ride up from a market perspective. And obviously there's been a slowdown. And so there's been a lot of criticisms in terms of delivery, in terms of, was this all just a bunch of, promotional, promotional items that happened and these stocks went up. The truth is that the fundamentals of the sector are still there. Is every company going to survive? As you alluded to, there's a lot of restructurings happening. No, every company is not going to survive, but the fundamental business proposition still exists. And so, we have to look past, we have to realize that these companies, some of these companies are only 4 or 5 years old at max, right? They're still evolving from the perspective of their business cycle, right? If you went back to the Googles of the world in year 5, what did those companies look like? What did Amazon look like in year 5? And so I think we have to temper our criticism. There is criticism that needs to happen. There was a lot of activity that happened. And I think we have to understand where these companies have come from. And I think that when you look at, there's been a lot of criticisms, for example, on management teams. And now, there's been a lot of churn in terms of management teams being replaced by, I would say, management from pharma or management from consumer goods companies. I think people have to recognize that this is not revolution, it's evolution of these companies.
Right,
that you needed these CEOs and management teams at the time to take it from a high risk enterprise, right? That needed to raise money, that needed to get to where it's gotten to. And you have to recognize them for the efforts that they've made to get these companies to a position where they need the next platform of management to come in and take these to the next level. And so it's not that they did a bad job. They did what they were supposed to do, getting it to here. And now it's time for, some of these, as we've seen, Fortune 500 CEOs type come in, ex-CEOs come in and take over.
So I'm sure there's some investors on the call today, Maruf. And one of the things that's always difficult to understand, and maybe you could give a little clarity for us on some of the financial metrics for cannabis companies. I know they're different than some of the traditional companies. Maybe you could just give us again a high-level overview on how the accounting is different.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think that you've raised an important point, because there is a lot of confusion in interpreting the results of these cannabis companies. And so obviously many of them are coming into profit right now, and then they're coming into EBITDA. That's still happening. But where one of the big issues has been is that because of a quirk in the accounting rules, these cannabis companies, particularly the public ones, they have to apply international accounting rules. And in those rules, there's basically a rule that says anything that's agricultural, right? You have to fair value the value of that agricultural activity. So in our case, the cannabis plants, as they're growing, are being fair valued. And so what's happening is that the profit is being recognized before the cannabis actually gets sold, which is very different from a traditional business where, you make a product, when you sell it, you recognize your profit. And so that is not the fault of the cannabis companies. That's the fault of the accounting rules. And so
We're
right
going to blame
now,
you then. You're confusing
don't blame
us.
the messenger. Don't blame the messenger. But yes. And so what's happened is that it's been very difficult to read these financials because it builds in all of these accounting quirks in terms of fair value into it. And so as an investor, where you should be looking, whenever you see these fair value amounts, and many of the companies try on their MD&A to reconcile that, but that's really where you should be looking. You should be going to the MD&A and saying, if I backed out all of this, these accounting fair value changes on the cannabis plants, what did I actually sell? What did I actually, what did I actually spend to make that? And so in some ways, the cash flow statement is perhaps more critical than ever before to represent the true picture of these companies. So
yes,
that's what I would say.
totally agreed. Yeah, I got to look at the bottom line, see how much cash is left, and especially because there are some opportunities now as we roll out the whole industry. Maybe you could talk about that. And I also want to get to the U.S. market as well. So maybe you could bridge the two there.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that, look, I think the opportunities are, when we started out, it was very much a cultivation model. I would say a vertically integrated cultivation model where the farmer, in effect, was the end seller, right? So the same company that was growing the cannabis, you went online, right? You got your prescription and they sold it to you. Now, if you sit back and you go, well, that doesn't exist for any other industry in the world. What other industry goes end to end, right? So if you look at the pharma sector, right, that if you're talking about let's say the painkiller, the high-end painkiller market, what pharma company grows its own poppy seeds, right? None.
Right. Yeah.
None. And so now that was the reason cannabis ended up the way it did, was because of legal aspects, right? Because federally you had to be legislated and you had to be the end-to-end customer. So the primary opportunity, and we're already seeing that, right? The primary opportunity is the separation of these different value chains, right? Because the truth is, how can you be good at everything? How can you be the expert at growing cannabis, also the expert at retailing cannabis, and also the expert in the supply chain of all of these things? Honestly, you can't. It doesn't exist anywhere else. Why do we think it exists here? So I think that is a natural progression that's going to happen. Separating out all of these different pieces of the cannabis supply chain. Right. And you're going to get people who are going to get better. And we are already seeing that. We're seeing companies in Canada now that are strictly retail. You're seeing companies that are strictly extraction, right? On the manufacturing side. And so I think these cannabis companies need to figure out who they are, right? And then focus in on that. I think if I have advice, that I give to my clients, or, we've tried to be everything to everybody, right? And I don't think that's a recipe for success.
And is that happening in the U.S. equally as much? I mean, how are they further advanced? I mean, I guess you have to go state by state almost, but what do you see as a general trend there?
Yeah, I think the U.S., as I think the main point you made is that it's so state by state. Right. Each state is legislating in its own way. So, when you look at California as an example, which is probably, in some ways the oldest, or the elder statesman of cannabis, Colorado certainly, there are elements that are still vertically integrated. So some of the states, you have the same issues of vertical integration, right? And then in other states, it's a little bit looser. So I think that where they are, I would say, ahead is that, firstly, from a consumer experience perspective, it's radically different when you are, buying cannabis as a consumer in the US. They don't have the same restrictions on branding, on stores, right? Generally for us, our retail and consumer experience is, for a diplomatic term, bland, right? And so I think that it's so I think that's where we followed more of the tobacco model, right? Don't advertise, don't talk about, just walk into a store, get in and get out. And so is that the right model? I'm not sure, but I would say that anybody who has, you know, walked into a US cannabis experience or a retail store can tell you there's fundamental differences there. I think they, are they, more ahead in terms of cultivation than we are? They did have a head start, but I think we're catching up. I would say that in some ways, when you walk into Canadian facilities, because we were so Health Canada driven in terms of approving those facilities, our facilities tend to be more, I would say, professional. I would say almost more pharmaceutical in approach.
Right.
And that's not to taint every U.S. Cultivator that's out there, but the general sense is that. And then of course there's the global side, right? When we're seeing, with some of our global cannabis clients, you go to Colombia, you go, in any of these countries, the cultivation scale of those countries and the cost profile is significantly
Lower,
disadvantageous to a Canadian producer,
right?
Right? So, when you're going into Colombia and you're seeing an all-in cost per gram of 5 to 10 cents, and in Canada, many of the LPs are struggling with getting under $1 a gram, you have to start, recognizing, what's what. So, when to come back to, the discussion we were having on what do we see for the cannabis sector going forward, one of the key discussions is, can Canada grow cannabis economically, right? And I would divide that discussion into two elements, right? There's cannabis as an input, right? And cannabis as a sort of a usable product, which is flower, and we smoke or vape vaporize the flower. Versus, we're going to use it to make edibles. We're going to use it, as an input into oil. When you start talking about cannabis as an input, it becomes a commoditized discussion. As much as the cannabis sector wants to say that it's not commoditized, it is commoditized, right? It's an input. All I care about is cost and my yield. Now, if we're talking about the cannabis, I would say combustible market, for sure, that is not a commoditized product. You're looking for premium grade, flavor profiles, et cetera, et cetera. And so, I think the discussion on the commoditized side is where we need to really look and say that, is this where Canada is best served, in the cannabis sector? Or is Canada best served like what we do in every other industry, right? We house the IP, we house the knowledge base, we house the funding, right? All of these companies come to Canada, to get resources, right? No different than we are when you look at the mining sector. What we are in the mining sector, and really when we have to recognize the mining sector for the cannabis sector today, a lot of the original risk capital came from the mining sector, and that's where we are today. And so if you look at
I agree. I think Canada really has a unique place in the world market for early stage capital, and I think it probably did start mining oil and gas, and I think we've evolved incredibly in the last few years because of cannabis. Let's just talk about the US for a few minutes, Maruf. Are you still seeing as much activity come into public market play? Is COVID slowing things down to a standstill, or is there still activity? I mean, obviously people need money for build outs. I'm just wondering if the activity is as, strong or medium, or where's it at right now for you guys?
So I think there's two elements of it. I mean, I think we could all agree it's definitely not what it was 18 months ago or 15 months ago, when there was just a flurry of every company that had looked at Canada, looked at the valuations, and wanted to come up here. What we see, there is still a tremendous appetite within the US to access capital, right? Now, do they care whether that capital is Canadian or American or European? No, they want the capital. They will go where the capital is right and where the valuations are right. And so currently, there's still, I would say, there's a big lineup of companies that are interested. I would say that right now, the valuations are not what they were. And with COVID, the financing aspect is a little bit more difficult. People are figuring it out. People are going to start doing virtual roadshows and all the other good stuff that comes with it. So there's definitely going to be more companies that are coming. It's not going to be to the level that it was before. And the other element of it is that on the US side, there are some private equity type, companies that are stepping in a little bit more than they were before, because they recognize that it's a big opportunity. So, will we see the same volume? No. I do think that we will see better quality of deals, right? And I think we dealt a lot of volume. Now I think we're going to see a different quality of company, because they still exist. For all the companies we've heard of, I think there's another 5 profitable US companies we have not heard of.
So we don't have to spend too much time on a US election, but it does always come into play, and obviously state by state as well. From what I'm hearing, there's not going to be any federal legalization coming with either party wins, but have you thought beyond that, some of the states, or maybe the Banking Act, that would make it a lot easier for US companies to have a bank? It seems to be so all over the place. I mean, for the investor, again, going back there, trying to figure out all these different scenarios and state by state. And I know it's an impossible question to answer, but maybe just a few comments on what you see down there.
Yeah, I mean, the first question we can ask ourselves, will there be an election? That's still up for discussion. But I mean, look, without wading into the political side, I think I will say the one beautiful thing about cannabis is that it is probably the first, I would say, bipartisan approach on anything I have seen in the US in a long time. I mean, the US is having a hard time agreeing on COVID from a party perspective.
Oh, yeah.
But more or less, they're kind of on the same path on cannabis, right? You have blue states and red states, and you know what? I think it's quite phenomenal that more or less, there isn't a big debate at a party level. Now, I think the unfortunate thing is that the Bank Act, that's unfortunate, right? That it hasn't moved forward in the way that it should have, right? And I think that honestly is what's holding them back. In some ways, it's facilitating more of the Canadian business, right? Because the truth is, as long as some of those restrictions are in place, a lot of the big US players from a funding perspective are not going to come in.
That's good news for us, you and I, anyway, for now.
For now.
Yeah. So let's just branch off just while I still have you here, Maruf. Talk about a little bit of some of the other industries. Let's start with the psychedelics. How big is that, and where is that marketplace going? Because again, I note not only my own confusion, but others on what exactly is happening there, and how big can this industry be?
Yeah, obviously from as an introduction for people who haven't sort of seen the psychedelic sort of movement yet, I think that, I guess it initially started with, people thought, well, the natural progression from cannabis would be something like mushrooms, right? Legalized mushrooms. And obviously it's evolved now, not just to mushrooms, but, there's a whole psychedelic aspect that goes beyond just, mushrooms, both synthetic and natural. And so, in many cases, like it's interesting is that in many of these cases, the medical aspects were already approved. They were already being utilized. So it's not like you're waiting for some future regulation to come down. For me, honestly, I think many people are looking at this as, oh, this is the next coming of cannabis from a market perspective. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's the case. I don't think it's the same scale that or volume that cannabis was. Having said that, I think there are some very interesting companies that are probably going to be profitable, that are probably going to have, very good valuations and go forward market caps. So I think they're definitely investable. There's probably, I want to say, 12 to 18, of these psychedelic type deals floating around. And it has been a natural progression. When you look at some of the people that are backing the psychedelics, there are some common names to the cannabis sector.
Yes.
And so there is a natural progression there. And at the end of the day, we always say in Canada, the money is always there, right? The money doesn't disappear. But it looks for new opportunities, and that's the entrepreneurial spirit of Canada, and us and you, and I think that's where it's looking to find a new home.
Okay, and maybe just a few last comments on other sectors that you guys are seeing, evolve or get enhanced, the mining sector. And I know you're on a panel of Esports with Richard Carlton, our CEO. Maybe you just want to plug that and talk about other sectors that you're seeing come to fruition again here in this difficult time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, not to take away the thunder from Richard on the esports panel that we're going to be on, but yeah, esports, it's very exciting. I think that's where there is a unique opportunity again, where it's something that's starting out. I mean, on a public markets level, at a grassroots level, obviously esports has existed for a little while, but I think the opportunity is significant there, right? And I think what's been interesting is, and we were actually talking about this today, was COVID has actually accelerated the esports public market story.
Yeah,
so
right.
It was already coming. It was already there. We were beginning to see the first couple of companies. But when you look at some of the results of some of these, I'm going to say esports / online gaming companies,
Right.
I mean, they're phenomenal.
Yeah.
If there's, other than the grocery sector and Amazon, if there's a sector that's been
Right.
boosted by COVID, it's esports.
Not many people going to Vegas right now, are there? Unfortunately.
You got it. Not for a while.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing is not so much a new sector, but where we do see a renaissance is the mining sector. Particularly, I mean, mining overall, but particularly the junior mining exploration sector. It's exciting. Everybody can see what's happening with the gold prices.
Right.
As we know, in uncertain times, we run to gold. But the exciting part is that Canada has historically been a resource-driven economy. Capital markets.
Oh, just lost you for a second, Maruf. You're back.
Sorry.
You might want to repeat yourself. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I was going to say that I haven't seen this much new sort of mining deal flow percolating in a long time. So I think it's exciting. I hope it's sustained. We're Canada, right? We support the resources.
Well, we really appreciate you taking the time, Maruf. Again, Scott Pritchard from the CSE. This video you'll be able to see on our website, thecse.com, very shortly. I thank you, Maruf, partner at MNP and head of the public markets there. It's always interesting, engaging. I hope to get to social distance with you very soon in one of our cities. And again, thank you, and thanks for the great collaboration that you have with us.
Yeah, thank you, and my deep honor, and thank you again to the CSE for hosting these events and all the support.